Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This week, someone I've wanted to have on the show for a while. We've been talking back and forth. Thaddeus Russell, author of A Renegade History of the United States, founder of Renegade University, and as far as I can tell, kind of a troublemaker and a roustabout. Is that a fair description?
Oh no, I'm a perfect citizen, Matt.
You're just perfect.
Yeah, I don't like to. I like to follow rules, and I think that society needs them, and norms, especially like moral norms, I think should be upheld. So no, I try to play it pretty straight. Yeah, I was considering a career as a Boy Scout leader, but that has some bad connotations to it. I was going to be a priest, but that does too. So basically, I just decided to be a great American my whole life, and just follow what the leaders tell me. I think that's wise, don't you?
Yeah, I think so. And let's for people that don't know who you are, why don't we upset people right out of the gate?
Let's do that.
And talk about your general theory about the history of the United States. Forget the founding fathers. It was all about street criminals and hookers, right?
Well, it was about both. It was about the interplay between both. So my thesis is that in American history, there have been groups of people not organized, acting spontaneously. For the most part, there was some organization, who were people considered to be the lowlifes, the lowest people on the social order, the scumbags, the dirt of society, who actually, by simply doing things they weren't supposed to do, by violating social norms, by violating the rules, by breaking the rules, they created sort of spaces of freedom that we all now occupy and take for granted. So, for instance, the big example I use is prostitutes in the 19th century were very powerful, very wealthy. They were the wealthiest women who were independent of men in our society, and they used a lot of that wealth to invest in real estate, like brothels and other real estate too, and they use their wealth for political power. And they also were the first women to walk in public alone without a male chaperone and without being shamed for it, because they were already shamed. And they were the first women to color their hair, to wear makeup, as I said, to earn high wages, to own property. There were a lot of madams, brothel owners, who acted as their own lawyers. So they were the first female lawyers in this country. They did a lot of stuff that looks like feminism and is not counted as feminism. And they're, of course, not counted as feminists. In fact, feminists were their enemies, and they were the ones who led the campaign called the Social Purity Campaign of the late 19th and early 20th centuries to lock up all the brothels and to put those women on the streets. And that's where they've been ever since, living in danger and terrible conditions and at the mercy of cops and pimps. So that's actually a great success of the feminist movement of the early 20th century, was putting those women on the street. So that's one example. It's the interplay between what I call the renegades, the people who violate the norms, who live according to their own pleasures and desires, and the moral guardians of our society, like the suffragists and the feminists and the founding fathers, for that matter, who were no fans of loose and promiscuous women right after the Revolution. In fact, the American Revolution, the founding fathers weren't directly involved in this, but their descendants were politically. They had founded a bunch of asylums for women who were either prostitutes or were just sexually promiscuous, or who simply didn't want to be mothers and wives. And actually, in those asylums in which they were locked, they were taught how to be mothers and wives, how to cook and clean and take care of children. It was an attempt to domesticate these women. So that's, in a nutshell, the theme of the book, the argument of the book. I apply to various other groups. I talk about slaves, about unassimilated immigrants, about the mafia during Prohibition, who, of course, broke the rules and sold us alcohol. And they basically destroyed Prohibition by being the front line army selling this illicit substance. That is Renegade History of the United States. That's the argument.
That it reminds me a lot of I'm a former Tea Party organizer, and I'm right. Still a community organizer of sorts. And so I had spent a lot of time studying the grassroots movement, the spirit of 76, that I never viewed as a top-down intellectual movement. It was always a bottom-up, a bunch of troublemakers in the streets that had enough discipline to do that sort of direct action stuff that was the Boston Tea Party, where nobody got killed, which would have normally been the system, but the ethos of America, and maybe it's the way that we all came over here from wherever we came from, but it was very much beautiful chaos. It wasn't centrally planned in any way, even though there was a sort of a few values that really held us all together.
Yeah, so the first chapter of my book is about, I guess, that world you're describing, which is sort of the revolutionary era in the United States. And it was funky, man. It was chaotic and funky and, as you said, largely unregulated. So it wasn't just prostitutes who were unregulated. Now, prostitution was illegal, but that law was largely unenforced. But lots of society's formal rules were unenforced. So one of the things that people don't understand is that during the Revolutionary era, there was actually quite a bit of racial integration going on. And this, of course, is when there was slavery in the United States. But if you went into a typical lower class saloon, which were ubiquitous across America, you probably would have found blacks and whites hanging out together, drinking together, dancing together. And in particular, the Irish and blacks were very close during this period. They co-invented tap dancing. They co-invented a lot of American slang. A lot of American English was created by those people, by African Americans and lower class Irish and lower class immigrants, created a lot of what you and I now say in our common vernacular. So that time before and during the Revolution is a great time in American history, because there was so much freedom in the streets, and you can actually see it, and you see the founding fathers complaining about it. You see John Adams and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson talking about walking down the streets of Philadelphia or New York and being appalled by what they're seeing, which was people doing what they wanted to do. Now, some of it wasn't so nice. I mean, some of it was selling sex, some of it was being drunk on the streets, some of it was dancing, wildly at some saloon or something. But you did see a lot of this kind of libertine freedom. And I know that some libertarians have a problem with the libertine and some don't. And that's kind of, I think, one interesting split among libertarians, right? There's sort of the pro-libertine, or the ones who are at least tolerant of the libertine, and those who are very hostile to it and don't want to see anything like that. But yes, that period in early American history is a time of immense, I call, personal, individual freedom, which you might also call libertine freedom.
Didn't Sam Adams have a particularly beef with British soldiers because they partied all the time and didn't show the proper moral behavior?
I don't know. He might have. It would certainly make sense. Yes,
Yeah.
they, to a man, every one of Sam Adams was actually one of the less puritanical ones, but to a man, every founding father, this is really important, publicly was
Right.
completely puritanical. Now, privately, there were a bunch, they drank like most Americans, which was like fish during that time. Americans drank just incredible amounts of alcohol during that time. But publicly, every one of them towed the Puritan line. They were staunchly opposed to drinking in public in their public statements. They were all about discipline and order and efficiency, and being a good citizen, and merging, this is the most important thing, merging one's identity, one's individual identity, with the new emergent nation state of America, right? So you are no longer Matt and I'm no longer Thad, we are now Americans, right? So the beginning of American nationalism. Now, this didn't always comport with their private lives. They were having sex with slaves, and they were drinking like fish, and they were probably fornicating in all sorts of ways they weren't supposed to be. But what they said to Americans was, look, here's the deal. If we're going to be a democracy, even a limited democracy, right, the people who get the vote can't be doing these things. You've got to, this is when sort of people started to understand what democracy really meant. It means discipline. It means more responsibility than it does rights, it turns out, right? Because if the people govern, which is the definition of democracy, well, you can't have the governors be a bunch of drunks fornicating in the streets, right? And so that's what the founding fathers said. And they also said, and this is really interesting, they said that democracy not only requires that kind of intense self-discipline, it actually creates it in people. Because what you're doing, what the founding fathers were doing was saying, okay, we're going to take away sovereignty from the crown, and we're going to give it to you, or at least some of you. What a gift. Wow, this thing. You now own and control and manage this country. Wow. And a lot of people got excited by that, and they disciplined themselves, right? And so it's part of classical liberalism too. Classical liberalism teaches, right, that we are self-sovereign, but that requires intense self-regulation, right? This was what John Locke's whole argument was, right? And the founding fathers took that up. So, I'm all for, right, the government staying off of us and in the classical liberal sense, leaving us to our own devices. But there's a lot of moralizing that goes on in the classical liberal tradition, which I think is not stupid, and it's not because they're just uptight. I think that it's actually the logic of both democracy and classical liberalism is that we have to moralize against ourselves all the time, against our own bodily desires, which creates this very uncomfortable tension in a lot of Americans, right? We want to be good. We want to be good, but boy, do we love watching TV, and we love drinking whiskey, and we love watching porn. So, and all sorts of stuff, right? I mean, and that's really true. I mean, there's a really stark, like, immense gulf actually between sort of American popular culture and what we do with our leisure time, and what we say and how we behave in public, and what we say in schools and in our workplaces and in the military and on TV and then when we run for office, right? We're all sort of good, upstanding American Puritans when we're in public. But my God, I mean, Pornhub just announced that there's 160 million views just from the United States every single day on their website. So, I mean, and that's just porn, right? I mean, you look at the rest of pop culture, it's awash in hedonistic pleasures, right?
Well, so they quarantined us in our houses for, what's it been, 6 months now? What did they think was going to happen?
I mean, the sort of energy, the chaotic, anarchic, and not a good way energy in the streets right now has to have a lot to do with that. I mean, it has to do with it. Yeah.
A lot of pent up frustration that goes back. I wanted to get to an article you wrote in Reason, and I'm hearing your theory, and I'm wondering what you think about this. I've never even thought about it this way before,
Sure.
but I've always thought of America's founding as very bottom up, and you had the founders who were willing to embrace a radical idea that individuals could be sovereign, and you didn't need some royalty, someone that's smarter and more generous than yourself to dictate that to you from the top down. Very radical, very democratic idea. Thomas Jefferson was a radical Democrat, and I would argue that the spirit of '76 was very much that beautiful chaos of the people in the street demanding that sovereign ownership of their own bodies and minds. But the puritanical part, as America moves forward, kind of gets weaponized, and it goes from a virtue that you are responsible for pursuing into, we need legislation to make sure that you don't drink. We need legislation to make sure you don't do this, that, and the other. And where I want to go with this is an article that I thought you wrote recently, but it turns out you wrote it in 2017 in Reason magazine. Don't like militarized police and mass incarceration? Blame progressivism. And I wonder if there is a line starting with this puritanism, this arrogance that you think you could tell someone else how to live your life and sort of weaponize it, impose it at the force of a gun, that has created all of these pathologies that we're seeing today.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And the quick answer is yes. So we are well known for our many, many laws, not just prohibition over the centuries now, banning, proscribing certain behaviors that are victimless, right? People have felt license since the revolution to lock women up for having too much sex, and then in the 20th century to lock people up for taking opium, and then in the 1920s for drinking alcohol, and then marijuana, and then the rest. Yeah, it goes on and on. Pornography's been censored, I think, and I often just sort of, the only answer I can offer is our Puritan heritage, for this. I mean, people, thank God, it's always been sort of a small class of people, right? I mean, there aren't that many kind of puritanical scolds running around, but there's enough. People who feel like it's their, not just their right, but their obligation to make sure that you don't do something bad tonight. And that, I think, comes from Christianity, basically, not just Puritanism, but the evangelical strain in Christianity. I mean, I think it comes from the Gospel of Matthew when he says, "Go out and convert all others into believers," and which is also often called the Great Commission by evangelicals. And we've been an evangelical and puritanical country since the beginning, which is a hell of a combination, right? I mean, Islam is quite puritanical. Judaism can be quite puritanical, but they tend to not be evangelical, right? So they tend to want to stay by themselves. But many Christians, in particular American Christians, have always had this incredible impulse, which is nearly unique among people. I don't know exactly why Americans have had it so powerfully, but we have, or Americans have, to go all around the world and make everyone look like us.
It's an interesting divide, because I would have instinctually drawn a slightly different distinction between, and I'll go back to classical liberalism and Adam Smith and the theory of moral sentiments, and Hayek when he talks about the natural evolution of social institutions. And I guess he would include marriage. I don't remember if he does, but I'm guessing that he does. But social institutions that kind of hold everything together, that emerge spontaneously because people are trying to figure stuff out, versus sort of the scientism and the fatal conceit and the that sort of arrogant, some people are smarter than others attitude that progressivism had. Do you buy that, or do you think that's a wrong configuration?
Meaning Smith versus the progressives,
Yeah.
meaning Smithian conception. I mean, I'm certainly more on his side in this. Yes, of course. I mean, progressivism. There's nothing about progressivism I have anything good to say about. I mean, to me, progressivism is imperialism. It's the same thing as imperialism. There's no meaningful distinction between the two. Progressivism begins with the idea in America that we must uplift the poor in the ghettos in the United States. We must go there. We must go into the ghettos, into the Lower East Side, and teach these Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants how to speak proper English. And we must teach the women and the men that the nuclear family is the only proper way to raise children, to get rid of the aunts and uncles who are living in the tenement with them. We must teach the men, proper work habits, and the women proper domestic habits, and the children how to be good Americans, right? And then they said, so that was beginning in the 1880s with all the immigrants. So it was this imperialist controlling mission domestically. By the 1890s, they said, wait a minute, it's not just, we don't just have poor people in the United States, there's poor people all over the world who are living degraded lives, and they have debauched cultures. Hence 1898 and the Spanish-American War and the invasion of Cuba and the Philippines and Guam, and then the colonization of the Philippines, and then putting schools in the Philippines where, staffed by American teachers who taught all the Filipinos to be Americans. And so that has been, yes, I mean, in the 20th century and the late 19th century, that's always been sort of at odds with a more classical liberal or libertarian tradition of letting individuals and markets decide these things. I mean, and that is the other part of the book I'm working on. So I look at the book I'm working on now, sort of history of America in the world. It's both sort of foreign policy, and it's how American popular culture has infiltrated other societies, and then by doing so sort of dissolved authoritarianism within those societies. So if we just let the market go and not have sort of government-led military interventions, I'll tell you exactly what's been happening for about 100 years now, which is in Berlin in the 1930s and the 1920s with the rise of Adolf Hitler. During the time of the rise of the Nazis, it was way more popular inside Germany than Adolf Hitler and the Nazis was jazz. Like, Germans loved jazz. They loved Hollywood movies. They loved Tarzan. They were all into that stuff. They loved, Berlin was the gay capital of the world at that time. So they had drag shows. I mean, it was sort of like Renegade. It was Renegade, the Renegade world. And a lot of that was driven by American pop culture. And we could talk about the hundreds of movie palaces in China in the 1930s and 40s that were showing American movies, but the nationalists and the communists didn't like that, so those ended up getting shut down. We could talk about it in the 1950s and 60s. I have a chapter in my last book, Renegade History, on, how jazz, rock and roll, blue jeans, James Dean, Elvis Presley, ultimately disco, just infiltrated every nook and corner, every nook and cranny of youth culture in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, and took that regime down from within over a decades-long process. That's what's been going on. We don't have to do anything, in other words, to take down radical Islam. We just let those satellite dishes on the roofs of every apartment building in Tehran keep beaming in our TV shows and our movies, right? You know, the mullahs in Iran and around the Middle East are issuing fatwas almost every day and have been for decades against American pop culture, because they know that a t-shirt or blue jeans or a piercing is not just a t-shirt or a blue, it represents the expression of individual desire against the collective, which in that case would be Sharia law, right? Yeah. Sharia law. So it's the worst thing for a single woman to watch, Housewives of Beverly Hills, or watch a Kim Kardashian movie or video or something like that. That's why they're terrified of it. So that's all we have to do. Let Adam Smith and his market go and keep the progressive imperialist do-gooder controllers out of there.
Yeah, well, including our own, because I feel like bombing a village with a drone sort of undermines the spread of American pop culture, I'm guessing.
That's exactly, it's a perfect point. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So in Germany, right, what happens is you have in the 1930s, you have just this explosion of American pop culture, which Hitler hated, and he banned all of it. And he banned imports from America immediately when he took power. But, you know, people still kept listening to it and still kept aping American ways, American pop culture ways. But it couldn't be stopped. I mean, it was just, you know, it continued, that impulse continued all the way through the war and out of the war. And in Eastern Germany, you had the same kind of renegade activity there. So you have like youth in East Berlin who are fighting the Nazis while wearing American like zoot suits. And then the next minute they're fighting the communists in the same place while wearing American zoot suits.
Yeah. Yeah. Part of that history, we've done a lot of work on the history of socialism in practice. I'm pretty anxious about the fact that the young people that are starting to think that socialism is cool again, and that pattern that you described with Hitler plays out again and again and again. You know, Castro banned the Beatles, and you could go to jail for owning a Beatles album. The Soviet Union, I actually went through one of the lists of all the albums that you couldn't listen to in the Soviet Union, and it almost cataloged my entire record collection as a young American kid. And in Yugoslavia, Tito, the first thing he did when he took over, he went after the poets and the artists and the free thinkers. And I think you put your finger on it. It's because they were independent.
That's right. In fact, I didn't actually finish answering your excellent question about U.S. military interventions actually retarding that process of pop culture getting in and doing the good work. That's what happens. Exactly. So when you declare war on another country, you often end up blockading that country, right? That's what happened with Germany. So my point about Germany was it was more full of renegades than the United States was when Hitler took over. I mean, Berlin was famous for, its gay, as I said, its gay nightclubs and its jazz clubs. And like you had whole generations of jazz musicians moving to Germany permanently because it was even more friendly to them there than it was here, right? So, but what happened was the Allies established a blockade around Germany early on, and that was what they wanted to do even before Kristallnacht. So what that meant was that it was very difficult to send anything into Germany, and it was also very difficult to get anything out of Germany, namely, Jewish refugees, right? But became more difficult to get the stuff in and to leave people out. So yes, intervention has that unfortunate blowback for the very people it's intended to help.
So I want to get into your theory about the roots of mass incarceration and progressivism. Yeah. It seems like a particularly relevant thing to talk about right now, but I feel like we should have you sort of empty out your closet a little bit, because I read your bio before we did this, and you grew up in Berkeley as a Marxist. You were radical before it was cool.
I did. I was born a Trotskyist. Yeah. My parents were members of a revolutionary socialist organization in Berkeley in the 60s and 70s. It was at that point, when I was born, they were members of the Young People's Socialist League, and then they became members of the International Socialists. If you've been If you've been on a college campus in the last like 20 years, you've probably seen their descendants. They're known as the International Socialist Organization, or ISO. They're kind of like small but loud minority on a lot of college campuses. That's my parents' crew. So yeah, I was raised around sort of Marxist talk and socialist. I didn't know what it meant, right? But my mission when I went to college was to figure out what socialism was, because I had to be one. And I did that, and I went to college and I read Marx and I read all the great socialists and I read the Russian history of the Russian Revolution. And that's when I was like, wait a minute, this is not looking so good to me. And Trotsky, I read Trotsky finally when I was in grad school. And I remember calling my mother up on the phone and saying, yeah, Mom, what I read here is a mass murderer. I don't know, like, what are you doing here? I mean, there's nothing good in here for me. And she's kind of like, well, yeah, some eggs had to be broken to make the omelet. Or something like that.
Yeah.
But it took me until my sort of mid 30s when I was fully enmeshed in the New York left and the academic left at Columbia as a grad student. It made less and less sense to me. And also the socialists, the people, were awful. I mean, you think libertarians have a bad rap in terms of personality? I mean, socialists are like libertarians, but mean. They have the same issues with like social awkwardness, but they're like mean as hell, right? And also,
and they're puritanical in their own way, right?
Super puritanical and hate popular culture. And like, I mean, I think that's a little bit different now with the very young sort of faux communists in Brooklyn, the hipster communists. But like until very recently, and I know from experience because I hung out with them, yeah, they never watched TV. They didn't know who Madonna was. They never went to the movies. They didn't listen to music. Except for classical music. It was all about reading and, theorizing and doing good, just like a good Christian. I mean, it's a Christian, socialism and Christianity, to me are kind of just the same impulse, same moral structure. Just one has God and the other doesn't.
Yeah. The thing about, modern socialism, but I don't know where to draw that line. Definitely this reconfiguration of democratic socialism. They skip over. So Marx, of course, has this arc of predetermined history, and before you get from late stage capitalism to this beautiful world of communism where everybody loves each other and hugs are free, and nobody wants for healthcare or food. There's this thing called a dictatorship of the proletariat, where even Marx himself and Engels and all those guys are like, we're going to have to kill a lot of people to knock them out of their old habits of owning property and wanting to work and wanting to provide for their families. And we've sort of forgotten that piece, or we've erased that piece from the theory, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that's sure. The modern left simply doesn't, well, it's funny. They do acknowledge it sometimes. They only acknowledge it in fits of rage. It's when they see some new billionaire build his new McMansion. It's almost always aesthetic, by the way, because, American socialism is an upper class phenomenon, like entirely. Let's be really clear. It's, middle and upper class people almost entirely, who are resentful of those who have more money than they have, namely the rich. So, when you see, some extravagant display of wealth, then you'll see like socialists come out with, God, we should kill them. Where are the guillotines? It's time. But, if you ask them in some public debate, some formal setting, at a university, right? No, there's no need for that. And I've been told that, because when I have socialists on my show, on my podcast, and I'll say, look, I like you. We're friends. It's going well. But I just need to know, like, after the revolution, you're going to be shooting at me, right? Because I'm not going to go to your meetings. You understand that, right? I'm not going to work in your factories. I'm not going to work where the collective tells me to work. I'm just not going to, you guys get this. I'm lazy. I say this to my socialist friends, like, I'm not going to work. What are you going to do to the people like me who won't work? And they're like, oh, it's fine. You don't have to work. I said, yes, I do have to work if socialism is going to work. Everybody has to work if the thing is going to work. And they just sort of punt on the whole question. But I wanted to say this about this sort of refusal to acknowledge what making the sausage really looks like on their part. I have been struck ever since I came into contact with libertarians about how absolutely, I think it's willful ignorance. I don't know, but they actually don't understand. I mean, people on the left, they actually don't understand the violence that's implicated in the state and and the state relies on violence. Its possession of the monopoly on violence, its application of violence, its threat of violence. The whole thing falls apart without it. And regardless of what kind of state it is and regardless of what they want to carry out. I mean, I've said this to people, on the left, like, if I get a parking ticket, or they'll say, well, what if you get a parking ticket? You just pay the fine. It's no big deal. I say, yeah, what if I don't pay the parking ticket? They'll say, well, then you get just another notice and you get, I say, yeah, what if I never pay any of those parking tickets, any of those notices? You know what happens? I become Corinne Gaines, who was the black woman in near you, I think in DC or in Maryland, who did exactly that. She had a bunch of traffic tickets and she just didn't pay them. And finally there was a warrant and they sent the SWAT team to her house and she was sitting at her kitchen table with a shotgun. And when the SWAT guy came to her front door with a rifle and pointed it at her, she pointed the shotgun at him and she was killed. And if she hadn't done that, she would have been taken to prison, to a cage. So over traffic violations. So yeah, there's always violence there. But the left, I think if any intervention needs to be made with the left, it's that. They need to be forced to deal with some of them understand it and they sort of just say, yeah, like the hardcore communists will be like, yeah, we got to kill a bunch of people. We get it. But most people on the sort of soft left who are like, bourgeois, upper, educated, went to Yale, et cetera, they don't get it. They don't get that it's about killing and caging people and stopping them from moving, stopping migration of people also. It's violence through and through the state.
Well, yeah, I see that cognitive dissonance where they're currently marching in the street, progressive socialists. So there's a bunch of different people marching for a lot of different reasons, but they seem to have righteous anger against the abuse of the monopoly power of police in the murder of George Floyd. And they seem to be just as angry about that as we libertarians have been angry about abuse of government power and the killing of innocent people since as long as we've been libertarians. But they don't go past that and say, but I still want to ban everybody but the cops from owning a gun.
But see, here's the thing, Matt. They're not clearly angry about, how'd you put it? Government abuse of power. They're not. They're interested in the racial distribution, the equal racial distribution of pain. They want pain to be equally distributed among the races. It seems, because they're very uninterested in actual structural reform. They absolutely refuse to acknowledge the fact that there are 500,000 white people in prison right now. They absolutely refuse to acknowledge that more white people get shot, unarmed white people get shot by cops every year than blacks. Yes, it's disproportionately black people who are affected, but I mean, if it's a racist agenda, that's a hell of a lot of collateral damage. I mean, the thousands and thousands and millions of white people whose lives have been literally destroyed, or at least mostly destroyed, over the last 30 years, 40 years of the drug war and the war on crime. I mean, that's a lot of damage to take for the racists, right? It's like, what racist would say, well, we're going to kill and incarcerate like millions of our people just to get at the blacks. No, it's about the state wanting order. And by the way, anybody who knows this topic at all well knows that the major calls, the most consistent, loudest calls for the war on drugs, for the mandatory minimums in the 60s and 70s came from where? It came from the black political class, not black people. Black political leaders and clergy were calling loudly for very tough laws against drugs and crime in the 60s and 70s. Michael Javon Fortner, sociologist at CUNY, has written a book on this. So the whole thing, I mean, there's just so much that is not understood by the people in the streets. And the thing that really bothers me, to me, the whole problem with it is the relentless, incessant racialization of it. When we could get the families and friends of some of those 500,000 white people to join in a coalition with Black Lives Matter to end the use of chokeholds, to stop sending military equipment to the police, to take their tanks away, to take their body armor away, to take their rifles away, to change the rules of conduct and engagement in police departments all across the country. And in fact, we kind of are. I mean, Minneapolis is doing that, right? And that's kind of good. But so maybe this is that moment. But for a long time there after Ferguson, there was a moment right after Ferguson when a lot of conservatives and right-wingers, not just libertarians, were saying, hey, the cops need to be reined in. And it was an exciting moment where we could actually bring together like someone like DeRay Mackison with someone like Mitch McConnell and actually have some real reform, right? And actually demilitarize the police, defang the police. But Black Lives Matter and the entire left just wanted to make about race, 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 race. And it wasn't, it wasn't so much about let's get the number 2.3 million down to a better number. I never heard that. It was just, it's disproportionate. It's just racially disproportionate. So I always thought, well, if you added more white people to San Quentin, is that going to make you happy? Yeah. So it needs to be a state analysis rather than a race analysis here.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
in class too. Very much a class analysis.
And the way I've been saying it, if we want to talk about systemic racism, we need to talk about the system that enforces through the monopoly power of the state policies that have racially disproportionate outcomes, like the drug war, like everything you just mentioned. Yeah. And let's segue to this, because I think you probably wrote this article. I thought this was a new article because it seems so modern given the state of things today, which I guess is a tragedy because you wrote it in 2017 and things have only gotten worse, not better. But talk about the history of progressivism, and we've dipped into a lot of these theories already in this short conversation, but how we got militarized police and mass incarceration in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, the war on drugs actually begins in the 1900s with Teddy Roosevelt and what was it called? The Pure Food Act, I think, in 1906. Yeah. So that was the first law against basically prescription drugs at that time. And a lot of those were opiates. So until then, drugs were basically all legal in this country. And so that was a progressive move. Teddy Roosevelt, very famous progressive. And then Prohibition, was the next move by the progressives. Again, people don't know this. Prohibition was a progressive cause completely, right? So that was the war on drugs. And then in the 1930s, Harry Anslinger and the Roosevelt administration, they launched the Reefer Madness war on marijuana, also progressives. And then in the 1960s, we have Lyndon Johnson and his crime bill of 1965. Which also was part of this very progressive administration. And then, of course, Bill Clinton, 1994, and Reagan is part of it. True. That's true. Some incarceration did go up, but the big spikes, the first spike is after Johnson in the 60s. And the big spike, as everyone knows, is in the 90s with Clinton and the 94 crime law. So here's the deal, like for centuries, you tell a whole group of people in this country, Black people, that they don't really belong. They're not really Americans. They don't belong here. They don't get the vote. They don't get the right. They were slaves for a while. They were completely left out. So what do you think they're going to do? What's their attitude about American norms and rules going to be, do you think? Some of them have been like, yes, sir, Uncle Sam. But most people generally, most African-American, or a lot of African-Americans in this country have at least been skeptical toward American, morals, right? And so, of course, when you have a black market, when you make a very popular substance like drugs illegal, who do you think is going to fill that market? It's going to be the people who care the least about, being good Americans. Well, Black people. So that's what happened. And that's why they've been disproportionately brutalized, is the word, by the war on drugs. The FBI has estimated that roughly half of all current prisoners in state and federal prisons are there for a drug-related offense, not necessarily a drug-related offense, but, like if you're poor and have a meth habit, what are you going to do? You're going to have to rob somebody, right? And that's very common. So a lot of people are in prison for drugs. So about half of the mass incarceration issue, the FBI and I and others believe, is about the war on drugs. So if we made all drugs legal tomorrow, decriminalized all of them, which I'm for, we're going to lose a huge chunk of our prison population, and we're going to reduce a lot of the deaths in the street from cops as well, because a lot of those killings of people were about drugs too. You know, all the gangs in this country, they didn't start, they didn't form themselves to just do violence. They formed themselves, I think, without exception, every single major gang in this country, who are responsible for most of the murders, by the way, they formed themselves as drug gangs, drug running gangs. And they're successful and powerful and wealthy because drugs are illegal, and they're full of really, really bad, violent people because drugs are illegal, and only really bad, violent people occupy a black market, not good, upstanding businessmen. This is all very simple. You and I and many others have known this for decades, and America is slowly coming to this realization. But if you simply ended the war on drugs, meaning decriminalized all drugs, including powder, man, African Americans would have much better lives.
So it's interesting that a lot of Republicans are coming around to this, and I would definitely add Richard Nixon into your Hall of Shame there. But he, of course, is every bit as progressive as anyone else you named. So I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But not nearly as cool about it as the other guys.
That's right.
Super awkward about it. But I mean, this I guess we should be hopeful about this, because there are a growing number of, it's almost a generational thing, where younger Democrats, far left progressives, AOC and her colleagues, they're all for pretty radical drug legalization. I don't know if they go as far as libertarians would go, but there seems to be a generational shift in that conversation, which is walking away from those progressive, authoritarian, puritanical, you need to live a certain way, and I'm going to tell you how to do it kind of roots.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, so what do we do with the fact that they want to legalize drugs? I mean, I'm glad, we support them. I support them in that, but at the same time, they want to make most of us into federal employees, right? Through the Green New Deal, they think working for the government is super cool. Which, by the way, like every hipster, every hipster lefty needs to be asked that question. Like, since when do you think that a government job is cool, right? Like working for, and by the way, this government, you want to work for this federal government, or even your state? Like, how many people, even on the left, like love their state government, right? Like, what do people think about their state, local, and federal governments? Even when it's their people, it's almost a gripe, right? It's almost always the main thing is a gripe, yet they're clamoring for those people to be their goddamn employers.
Yeah, yeah.
And to wear a uniform, I guess, like to have a flag on you. These people want to have you think it's not going to be an American flag on your shoulder, buddy? Like hipster in Brooklyn? What do you think they're going to do to you? Like, and do you think the military will have no interest in this whole new project of everybody working for the government? You think the military won't enjoy this at all and see like a lot of easy recruits from this? Come on. I mean, talk about a retrograde policy initiative. And conservative and nationalist and reactionary and as anti-left and as I can imagine, employing much of the population by the government. What could be worse? Yeah. It's also, well, as we know, what was very, very popular among many governments in the 1930s, here and in Europe.
Yeah. So. Speaking of retrograde, Joe Biden, you didn't mention him in the Hall of Shame of people that have incarcerated so many Black Americans. But I watched that video. It's, all the Trump guys are sharing this video of Joe Biden on the Senate floor bragging about how many more people he was going to put in jail. And those same hipsters that apparently want to wear government uniforms when they go to work, they now have to vote for Joe Biden.
Well, some of them. I mean,
that's not fair.
There are some good principled leftists out there who have the same take on Biden as that you and I do. I mean, I did mention the '94 crime bill. Of course, he basically wrote that and was its chief proponent. Yeah, I mean, is there an American politician active now in the United States who's more responsible for mass incarceration? I don't think so. Right? I think he's the champion. There's also that video of him bragging to a group of Democrats that he voted for building 700 miles of fence, which is